At my mother-in-law's anniversary gala in Vancouver, my name tag was missing from the seating chart. My husband laughed and said, "Oh, must have been a mix-up at the printer," while his family smiled into their wine glasses. I set down my clutch, looked at him calmly, and said, "Seems like I'm not on the guest list." Then I walked out. 40 minutes later, the entire event collapsed, the florist left, the catering crew packed up, and the venue's event coordinator informed the Whitmore family that all guarantees had been withdrawn. I watched it happen from the hotel bar across the street, sipping a glass of Pinot Gris, and I felt nothing but free. Seems like I'm not on the guest list. My own voice still echoed in my ears as I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the Fairmont Pacific Rim and stepped out into the cool Vancouver night. The salt air off Burrard Inlet hit my face, and I let myself breathe for the first time in what felt like years. No tears. Not then. Instead, a strange, clean calm settled over me as I reached into my evening bag and opened the app I had built my entire career on. I had 40 minutes before they'd realize what I'd done. That was more than enough. Before I tell you what happened that night, I want you to understand who I was before the Whitmores got their hands on my life. My name is Claire Beaumont. 38 years old. Founder and sole owner of Beaumont Event Co., one of the most sought-after boutique event production firms in the Pacific Northwest. I didn't inherit the business or the connections. I built it from a one-bedroom apartment in East Vancouver with a laptop, a second-hand Canon camera, and a willingness to take calls at midnight when a bride was panicking about her centerpieces. By the time I met my husband, Beaumont Event Co., he was managing corporate galas for Vancouver's tech sector, charity fundraisers for hospitals, and private celebrations for families whose names appeared regularly in the pages of Vancouver magazine. I had vendors across the Lower Mainland who trusted me, venues that gave me priority booking, and a reputation for making the impossible happen without ever once losing my composure. That composure, it turned out, was the very thing the Whitmore family would spend 4 years trying to destroy. I met my husband, Daniel, at a fundraiser I organized for BC Children's Hospital in the fall. He was standing near the silent auction display, hands in the pockets of a very well-cut navy blazer, looking slightly bored in the way that people who attend too many events often do. He introduced himself, asked intelligent questions about how I'd sourced the live art installation, and before the night was over, asked if he could take me to dinner the following week. He was warm and funny and paid genuine attention when I spoke. I thought he was different from the men in his world. His family was what Vancouverites called established. The Whitmores were old BC money forestry and commercial real estate, the kind of wealth that had been compounding quietly for 3 generations. They didn't need to flaunt it. It showed in the way Daniel's mother, Patricia, wore the same simple pearl earrings to every occasion and spoke in a measured tone that made everything she said sound like a final decision. His father, Robert, was gregarious in public and remote in private. His sister, Jocelyn, was 2 years younger than Daniel and had the sharp social instincts of someone raised to protect a family brand. The first sign came at the dinner where Daniel introduced me to his parents. Patricia shook my hand, looked at me for a moment longer than necessary, and said, "Claire Beaumont. You're the one who does the parties. Not runs an event production company. Not built a business. Does the parties." I smiled and said yes. Daniel squeezed my hand under the table and later told me his mother didn't mean anything by it. I believed him, the way you believe things when you're falling in love with someone and choosing not to see clearly. We were married 18 months later in a ceremony I largely organized myself, because I was constitutionally unable to hand that responsibility to anyone else. Patricia had opinions about everything. The venue was too modern, the menu too international, the florals too unconventional. I accommodated what I could and held my ground where it mattered. Daniel played peacemaker, which I would later understand was his permanent role in the family. The person who smoothed things over without ever actually changing them. After the wedding, my usefulness to the Whitmore family became a running theme. They hired Beaumont Event Co. for their events, Robert's firm's annual client dinner, Jocelyn's engagement party, the family's annual holiday gathering at their West Vancouver home, and then spent the duration of each event quietly diminishing my contribution. Patricia would describe me to her friends as Daniel's wife. She handles our events, always with a particular tone that placed handles squarely in a service category rather than a professional one. When I offered creative suggestions at family planning meetings, they were considered and then discarded in favor of what Patricia had already decided. When a gala I produced for their family's charitable foundation was covered in the Vancouver Sun, the quote they gave the reporter credited the Whitmore family's vision. My company's name appeared once, near the bottom. Daniel never said anything. He'd listen to me later, at home, and say that I was too sensitive, that his family respected me, that this was just how they communicated. I started keeping a list, privately, not out of spite but because I needed to know I wasn't imagining things. The opportunity that unraveled everything was the Whitmore Anniversary Gala. Robert and Patricia's 40th wedding anniversary, a formal seated dinner for 80 guests at the Fairmont Pacific Rim, planned over 8 months. Patricia came to me directly, which I understood to be the closest thing to an honor she'd ever extended. I threw myself into a completely custom menu, developed with the executive chef, florals sourced from a grower in the Fraser Valley, a string quartet I'd worked with at 3 previous events, printed programs with hand-calligraphed guest names, a 10-minute video tribute I personally edited from family photographs spanning 4 decades. It was during the production phase that the financial picture started to shift. Invoices I submitted to the family's account were slow to be paid. One vendor called me directly after not hearing back on a deposit confirmation. When I mentioned it to Daniel, he was evasive in a way that made something tighten in my chest. I'd seen this pattern before in clients whose cash position was changing quietly. I noted it, kept moving, and used Beaumont Event Co. as own accounts to guarantee deposits where needed, telling myself it was temporary. Then came the morning I found his phone unlocked on the kitchen counter. I wasn't looking for anything, but the screen was open to a message thread with a contact listed only as M, and the preview showed 4 words. "We still on for Whistler?" My fingers moved before I made a conscious decision to move them. The messages went back 7 months. Her name was Meredith. She was someone Daniel had dated before me, someone his family had apparently never stopped hoping he'd find his way back to. There was warmth in the messages, familiar warmth, and there were references to a future being planned, one that didn't include me. I set the phone down exactly where I'd found it. I poured my coffee. I stood at the window and looked out at the North Shore Mountains in the morning light and understood, with a clarity that felt almost clinical, that I had been building toward this moment without knowing it. I didn't cry. I took photographs of the screen with my own phone, forwarded them to my personal email, and went to the office. What I found over the following 2 weeks, as I moved carefully through documents I had legitimate access to as the event planner managing Robert's firm's accounts, was considerably worse than an affair. The Whitmore family's financial position had been deteriorating for years. Properties were mortgaged past their value. A significant investment in a commercial development project in Richmond had collapsed. Lines of credit that had always been quietly available were now quietly maxed. The gala I was planning, the elaborate, expensive evening, meant to signal 4 decades of Whitmore permanence, was being underwritten almost entirely by Beaumont Event Co. Is deposits and guarantees. They had never intended to be slow paying. They were incapable of paying. And Daniel had known. The conversations with Meredith, whose family, I gathered from context, had the kind of liquid assets the Whitmores no longer possessed, were not just romantic. They were strategic. I continued planning the gala. I confirmed the florals. I approved the menu. I met with the venue's event coordinator, a woman named Sandra who had worked with me across a dozen events and trusted my judgment completely. I said nothing about what I knew. Instead, I began making a second set of arrangements, quietly, in parallel, the way any good event producer manages contingencies. The morning of the gala, I arrived at the Fairmont 4 hours early to oversee setup. Everything was, genuinely, beautiful, the kind of beautiful that made me briefly sad, because I was good at this, and some part of me always would be. The tables were dressed in ivory and sage, the candles lit, the quartet doing a final sound check near the window that overlooked Cole Harbor. I spoke with Sandra, confirmed the timeline, and made one additional arrangement that I described to her as a standard payment authorization update. She nodded and filed it without question. We had worked together long enough that she extended me professional courtesy without demanding explanations. I returned to the hotel to change. Daniel was already dressed, checking his cufflinks in the mirror. He looked at me when I came in, a flicker of something in his expression that I recognized now as the calculation of a man running out of time, and said I looked beautiful. I thanked him. The Whitmore family assembled in the lobby at 7. Patricia in a gown she'd had altered from an event 2 years prior. Her pearl earrings in place. Her posture as composed as ever. Robert, red-faced and jovial in the way of men who have learned to perform confidence. Jocelyn and her husband, Marcus. Two sets of family friends who flew in from Victoria. And at the far edge of the group, almost as though the arrangement had been intentional, there was a woman I had never met, introduced to me briefly as Meredith, an old family friend. She smiled at me with the particular warmth of someone who knows something you don't. We arrived at the venue to the kind of entrance I had designed: the music, the lighting. The moment of arrival that makes guests feel they've stepped into something genuinely special. People found their seats. I followed Daniel toward where our names should have been, near the head table, and discovered that where my name card should have been, there was nothing. No card. No place setting. 2 chairs for a guest couple I didn't recognize had been inserted in the space that should have held mine. I stood there for a moment. The quiet was very loud. Is something wrong? Patricia's voice, perfectly calibrated to carry just far enough. There seems to be a problem with my seat, I said. The choreography that followed had clearly been rehearsed. Jocelyn frowned and said she wasn't sure what had happened with the seating. Robert cleared his throat and suggested it might be a printing error. And then Daniel, my husband, who had stood beside me at the altar and said words I had believed, offered a small, helpless shrug and said, "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. Must have been a last-minute mix-up." The table looked at me. Some faces blank, some carefully neutral, Meredith's with that same composed warmth. I understood in that moment, with absolute precision, what this was. Not a mistake. A stage direction. They wanted a scene: the unsuitable wife, overwhelmed, making it awkward, giving them the exit narrative they needed. I had been the event planner long enough to recognize a production when I was inside one. I picked up my clutch. "Seems like I'm not on the guest list," I said. My voice was steady. "I'll see myself out. Claire, don't make this." Daniel started. I didn't wait to hear what he thought. I shouldn't make this. I walked through the room the way I always moved through venues, with purpose, without hurry. Nodded to the sommelier who had worked 3 of my events, and took the elevator down. The hotel bar gave me a clear sightline to the entrance of the event space upstairs through the mezzanine windows. I ordered a glass of Quailsgate Pinot Gris and opened my laptop. What followed next was not impulsive. I had prepared for this exact contingency for 11 days. The first call went to Renata, my florist, whose arrangements were the most visually spectacular element of the room upstairs. Renata and I had worked together for 6 years. I told her the client had defaulted on the remaining payment balance and that per our agreement, she had the right to remove the arrangements if payment wasn't received by end of business. She asked if I was certain. I said I was. She said she'd send her crew. The second call went to Chef Marcus at the catering company. The situation was similar: the outstanding balance on the food and service contract, which had been guaranteed by Beaumont Event Co., was being withdrawn. The guarantee was mine to withdraw. It was in the contract. Marcus was professional and unhappy and ultimately compliant. The third call went to Sandra, the venue's event coordinator. I walked her through the payment authorization update I had made that morning, the one that had shifted the guarantee on the room from my company's account to the Whitmore family's direct billing. I explained that the family would need to provide a new payment method to continue holding the space under the event terms. Sandra said nothing for a long moment, and then said she would handle it according to standard procedure. I texted the string quartet to let them know the event timeline had changed, and they were released for the evening. They were paid in full from Beaumont Event Co's account, because that's who had contracted them. And I had already processed their final payment before arriving at the venue. Then I sat back and finished my wine. The messages from Daniel started at 7:52 p.m. First annoyed: "Where did you go? Come back, this is embarrassing." Then confused: "The florist is here, what's happening?" Then something closer to panic: "Claire, what have you done? Call me right now." Then, just before 8, "The venue is asking for a credit card. My parents don't have, call me. Please." I watched through the mezzanine window as a cluster of formally dressed people began moving through the hallway in a way that no one moves when an evening is going well. I could see Robert near the elevator, his posture no longer confident. Patricia standing very still beside him, one hand at her throat. Jocelyn on her phone, moving toward the window with the expression of someone trying to maintain control of something that has already left her hands. I went upstairs. I came through the main entrance at 8:15, when the dismantling was fully underway, Renata's crew removing the centerpieces with quiet efficiency, the catering staff clearing the food service, guests redistributed into uncomfortable clusters near the walls. 80 people in formal wear, no dinner, no music, no flowers, the overhead work lights of the venue beginning to come on in sections as the event lighting was shut down. 12 faces turned toward me when I walked in. Some angry, some frightened, some simply unable to process what they were seeing. Patricia spoke first. "You have absolutely no right." "I have every right," I said. "Every contract in this room was signed by Beaumont Event Co. Every deposit came from my accounts. Every vendor relationship was mine. I simply updated the terms." I looked at her steadily. "Though I'll note that this is almost exactly what you had planned for me tonight. The difference is that I changed the ending." "You'll hear from our lawyers," Robert said, his voice raised. "I look forward to it," I told him. "My lawyer already has the financial documents. The ones showing that Beaumont Event Co. has been underwriting Whitmore family events for the past 14 months while your accounts were being drained. I'm sure your investors will find the timeline very instructive." The color left Patricia's face in a way I had never seen before and will not forget. I turned to Daniel. He was standing apart from his family, slightly, in the way of a man who has just realized that the side he chose is the losing one. He looked at me with something that might have been genuine grief if there had been enough honesty between us to name it properly. "The documents about Meredith are with my lawyer as well," I said quietly. "Just so you know what you're working with." I left through the main entrance and took a cab to my sister's house in Kitsilano, where I had already moved a suitcase 2 days prior. My phone was continuous for most of the night. "Patricia," cold and formal, "this will not stand, you will regret this." "Jocelyn, you've humiliated this family in front of 60 guests, I hope you're proud of yourself." "Robert, our legal team will be in contact Monday." And Daniel, in a sequence that told me everything about the order of his priorities. First anger, then calculation, then very late, past midnight, something that might have been remorse. "I never wanted it to happen like this. I know that doesn't help. I'm sorry." I didn't respond to any of them that night. I sat in my sister's kitchen and drank tea and let her be angry on my behalf, because I was too tired to be angry anymore. Daniel appeared at my office 3 weeks later, unannounced, looking like a man who had not been sleeping well. The polished ease that had first attracted me to him had been replaced by something rawer and less confident. He said that his parents' solicitor had advised them against pursuing litigation given the documentation I held. He said that Meredith and the situation with her were more complicated than they'd appeared, which I suspected was his way of saying they'd fallen apart. He said he was sorry. He said it more than once. I let him finish. Then I asked him, genuinely, what exactly he had wanted from our marriage. Whether he had loved me or whether he'd needed someone capable and competent to run the social infrastructure of a family that was quietly falling apart, and then planned to swap me out when a more financially advantageous option appeared. He didn't have an answer, which was its own answer. "I want the house in Burnaby off the table," I told him. "I bought into that mortgage before we were married. My lawyer will send the terms. And I want it resolved before Christmas." He nodded. He left. He didn't fight it. The dissolution of the Whitmore financial empire was not dramatic. It was the slow, grinding kind: assets sold, holdings restructured, names quietly removed from boards they had sat on for decades. The investment group filed a notice of creditor arrangement 6 months later, which made a brief appearance in the business section of the Vancouver Sun before being buried by larger news. Patricia stepped back from 2 charitable organizations she had been involved with for 20 years. The West Vancouver house went on the market in the spring. Beaumont Event Co. recovered all outstanding receivables through the legal process, plus interest. My lawyer described the settlement as unusually clean, which I attributed to the quality of the documentation I had kept. The divorce was finalized the following November, without drama. My share of the Burnaby property was transferred to my name. I sold it 6 months later, and used the proceeds to expand the business 2 new full-time staff, a proper office in Mount Pleasant instead of the home studio I'd been operating from. The year Beaumont Event Co. had its best revenue in its history was also the year I stopped trying to be the kind of woman the Whitmores had always wanted me to be. On the anniversary of the gala, I was managing a private corporate retreat on Vancouver Island for a technology firm headquartered in Gastown. I was standing on a deck overlooking the Strait of Georgia in the early evening, tablet in hand, going through the next morning's schedule, when one of the junior staff asked me how I'd gotten into event production in the first place. I told her the honest version, the East Van apartment, the second-hand camera, the midnight calls. She said it sounded exhausting. I told her it was the best exhausting I'd ever found. What the Whitmores had tried to do, in their way, was make me feel that my value was provisional, that belonging in their world was something they extended to me conditionally, and could withdraw whenever I stopped being useful. They were right that they could withdraw it. What they miscalculated was the cost of doing so, and what I would do with the freedom. I raised my coffee mug to the water and the last of the evening light, and I didn't think about the missing name card, or the anniversary gala, or a hotel room with the work lights coming on. I thought about the morning schedule and the florals arriving by 7, and the fact that every vendor on that island, every contract, every relationship, every single thing that would make the next 2 days exceptional, all of it was mine.